Okay. Um, so now I'm going to pick up. We're still talking about the 1970s. This would be the second lecture video that we have there. I'm going to pick up with OPEC. And you can see there's a little tiny map here on this slide. It kind of gives you an idea of who the OPEC countries are. It's Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And you need to be familiar with OPEC because first, if it's a global organization that can influence the American economy, we certainly see that it does that in the 1970s. And in a lot of ways, we still deal with OPEC today. One of the things with the recent low oil prices has been that because OPEC played with us a little too much, right, and kept oil prices too high, the American economy responded by focusing on domestic oil production and investing in how to get oil from our own territories. Well, what's going to happen is that's going to make it so we don't have to buy as much of their oil. And so OPEC, it really has been causing them some financial problems. And there's some people that feel very paranoid that OPEC is intentionally gutting the market. It's hard to say. Maybe they're playing a long game of trying to get Americans dependent on their oil again. But understand that this goes back to the 1970s. What's going to happen, and we'll talk some more about Middle Eastern policies, because that's really a whole separate kind of aspect to American foreign policy that's really particularly relevant going into the 21st century with 9/11. But if you look in the 1970s, you'd had the U.S. and Great Britain in particular really trying to manipulate and influence Middle Eastern countries, largely because of oil reserves. And they do some things. They back some people that aren't very nice. And in doing so, one of the other groups, and I'm not making a judgment on Israel at all, but you definitely see that American support of Israel, particularly in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors, is going to tend to create some bad feelings towards the United States. And so the attitude of these oil-producing countries is going to be, well, you know what, we may not have the military to stand up to the United States, but we can certainly affect their economy. And so it's not just the Yom Kippur War. It's also kind of American behavior in the Middle East for a good 15 years before the 1970s, really since the end of World War II. But even then, the lesson you need to learn is that OPEC is a foreign entity that's able to influence the American economy. One of the main ways they do this is creating an embargo against the United States. And they refuse to ship us oil. And that's going to create a huge oil shortage, like overnight. It's going to jack up oil prices. It's going to create a major energy crisis. So again, this all kind of dovetails with kind of the environmental movement that's going on in the 1970s. So you're going to have, because OPEC has the embargo, because of American actions in the Middle East, we're going to have this economic crisis that's going to lead to extremely high oil prices and that kind of thing. Let me get this thing to change here. There we go. And you can see there that you've got where they limited gas. You could only consume so much. You could only buy gas on certain days based on, if your license plate ended with an odd number or an even number, that kind of thing. And so they just have these kinds of limitations, in a way, rationing, in a way that we hadn't seen prior to, since World War II in a lot of ways. And so just kind of keep that in mind, that this is the result of the oil embargo. And this is part of our general frustration in the 1970s, that these foreign entities can kind of affect us like this. And of course, you have, we hadn't really had too much frustration with the United Nations at this point. We were certainly fed up with dealing with global issues in foreign policy. The consequences of Nixon and the economic circumstances and all that kind of stuff are going to be lots of distrust of the government, a lot of frustration, right? And we have this real sense of economic uncertainty. And it's into this that you're going to have poor old Gerald Ford, right? Gerald Ford, he was the Speaker of the House. So he moves up into the vice presidency when Spiro Agnew resigns because he's going to jail. And then when Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford comes in and becomes the president. So he was never actually elected. That doesn't mean he was a bad guy. He was a Republican. He tries to do the best with what he can. Just understand that the economy is a mess. The oil embargo is a mess. Everyone's very distrustful. There's all this this general fatigue and frustration with everything, with political correctness and with social rights and with foreign policy and all that kind of stuff. And so he comes in and he tries to clean it up. He basically pardons Nixon, right, which really frustrates a lot of people. This is going to be one of the reasons why Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, is going to win in 76 is because, people are going to look at the Republicans and say, oh, yeah, clearly they didn't want Nixon to be, tried in a public court and all that kind of stuff. Really what Ford's trying to do is get the United States to move past this, to not focus on what's happening, to focus on, the economic crisis, that kind of thing. He's got his whip inflation now. He's trying to, voluntarily reduce oil consumption. And remember how that voluntary stuff worked for Hoover, right? And you're going to see we do have the Helsinki Accords, where basically we recognize the borders of Eastern Europe. This is kind of the last phase of kind of the detente that we saw beginning under Nixon. Helsinki is going to be where basically we're going to stop trying to pester and annoy the Soviet Union over their Eastern European borders, and kind of get everybody to stand down a little bit, I guess you could say. So that's really kind of the big impact from Ford. Again, he doesn't do very much. He's only around for a couple of years. He will try to run in 76, but obviously people are so fed up with the Republicans. So in 1976, you're going to have Jimmy Carter. He was the governor of Georgia. He campaigns very much as kind of an outsider. I'm not part of DC politics. I'm a new face. I'm going to clean things up. Very kind of Democratic. He's going to bring in Democratic policies. And people are so frustrated with Nixon and Ford that they're okay with this, right? And so what will happen is that he'll come into Washington, D.C., but he's not, and of course, Jimmy Carter's still alive, and he's a great humanitarian, very much big in human rights. However, he doesn't lack really kind of the ability to work with DC and to make things real effective there. And so he never can quite get anything going. Is that because the Democrats in Washington didn't respect him? Is that because, the Republicans just didn't feel like they needed to work with him? Is that because the American public was so fatigued? It's hard to know exactly. But he ends up not being able to do very much. And you're going to see that instead of creating tax cuts, kind of doing a supply side kind of injection into the economy, let's give some adrenaline, cut people's taxes so they have more money to spend, and continuing to kind of trim up some of the government programs that you had seen happening under Nixon, and to a lesser extent Ford. He says, what we're going to do is control how much money is in the economy, and we're going to focus on reducing oil dependency. Well, that's all well and good, except those responses take years to be noticed, right? They don't tend to have that shot of adrenaline, which in 1976, 1977 was absolutely what the economy needed. And so he really kind of responds poorly economically. In a lot of ways, he's just out of his element. And you're going to see that people kind of don't pay attention to his campaign to reduce consumption. And you start to have more instability in the Middle East, most notably the Iran hostage crisis, which we'll talk about some more here in a little bit. But, the Iran hostage crisis is going to take place in 79, I think it is. And what will happen is it's really kind of the Iranians were trying to decide between the Soviet embassy, the Canadian embassy, and the American embassy. And they just kind of chose the American embassy. Now, the Iranians were upset at all Western powers, right? They were upset at all these different countries for different reasons. And this is all kind of part of an Islamic resurgence in the Middle East and kind of this, fundamentalism that comes into these Middle Eastern territories in the 1970s. But the target is going to end up being the United States and the U.S. Embassy, and that's going to make Carter look really, really bad, really, really weak, like he wasn't paying attention. He was so focused on, these failed policies of money supply and reducing oil dependency and energy consumption or conservation, and kind of scolding China and scolding the Soviet Union over communism and human rights violations, so much so that he actually has a boycott of the 1980 Olympics, right? Which really upsets a lot of Olympic athletes. And people say, you're focusing on that, but here we have this Islamic terrorism going on, and you didn't pay any attention to that. So it ends up making him look really, really weak. So Carter, for all that, he's not really a bad guy. He just he doesn't provide good leadership. His economic policies are not the right policies for the time. Very kind of, Hoover-esque, and he's the wrong guy for the time. Now he does lead the Camp David Accords, which are kind of a big kind of foreign policy development for him, where he kind of negotiates a peace between Egypt and Israel. And that's known as kind of one of the big high points of his presidency. So you will need to be familiar with the Camp David Accords, and we'll go into some more detail on that. But that's, you'd had this long period of tension with Israel and these other Arab countries. And the Camp David Accords is kind of the first major step in trying to achieve kind of peace in that region. Obviously, it hasn't barely done that much, but it does resolve things between Israel and Egypt, which I suppose is a really good thing. Israel's the nearest neighbor to the west of Israel. So you definitely see that, and that's what this one picture that's in color is of the Camp David Accords with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And then you can see the picture below that is from the Iranian hostage crisis. And again, of course, that ends up making him look very weak. He was a huge advocate for human rights. It's under him that we have this promise to return control of the Panama Canal. Got a lot of criticism for that. Again, his focus is on, countries having independence and human rights and all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't always mean that his policies were the most well advised. I mean, fortunately, Panama having control of the Panama Canal hasn't seemed to be a problem. But certainly when he makes this agreement in the late 70s and agrees to turn it over in 1999, people were not very happy about it. He does this whole boycott of the Olympics. He's very critical of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which happens under his watch. And of course, depending on how much you know about the rise of Osama bin Laden, part of his rise is going to have to do with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the perception that these other powers were coming in. They were trying to take over these territories. And the U.S. ends up sending a lot of military equipment into Afghanistan to the Taliban to help them, equip them, train them to fight the Soviets. And so this kind of affects the relationship with the Soviet Union. So we start to have a little bit of tension there. And so all the work that Nixon had done to kind of resolve that part of American foreign policy seems to fall apart. And so he gets some criticism for that, for messing up that part of it. And of course, then we're going to have the rise of the Islamic State in the Middle East, particularly in Iran. And that's most notable. If you think back to and I put on here the covert operations under Eisenhower, one of the things that the CIA does is orchestrate a military coup in Iran that removes the democratically elected leader and puts the Shah of Iran back in charge. The Shah is an anti-communist, so the U.S., of course, likes him. Unfortunately, he's not a very nice guy. He does some pretty... he punishes people, tortures them, uses the military to maintain control. So he's not particularly popular. And one of the problems that we're going to see with that is that he will eventually be overthrown because you will have this Islamic fundamentalist kind of resurgence coming in with the Ayatollahs, and this is where you have the rise of the theocratic states and the imams and all that kind of stuff that we see, people talking about a lot. and Iran and Iraq and all these different areas, right? The whole concept of ISIS, which is that it's a theocratic state. It's a state where the church basically runs it, and so you definitely see that that's kind of what happens in Iran, and that's kind of an outgrowth of what we had done in the 1950s and the way we had treated the Middle East and that sort of thing, and so just kind of keep that in mind. And so you're going to have Carter kind of left holding the bag with the Iranian hostage crisis. Tries a couple of rescue missions that don't work very well. Part of what triggers frustration too is Carter will allow the Shah of Iran, who's been exiled at this point, right? But he needs to seek medical treatment, and so the U.S. allows him to come into the United States to have treatment for cancer, and of course this inflames the Iranians against the U.S. and that kind of thing, because they see the Shah as a war criminal, and they think that the U.S. is basically harboring a war criminal, and so then Carter's going to try a couple of rescue missions that fall apart, and it's just going to make him look really, really bad, and so in 1980 is an election year. He's going to lose big to Ronald Reagan. Shortly after Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office, the Iranian hostages will be freed. And there'll be some interesting kind of perceptions about Reagan and his relationship with Iran, because we'll talk about the Iran-Contra scandal with him. But it's all very kind of interesting. You definitely see that the 1970s are a period of great frustration and fatigue by the American public, and Ford and Carter, it just, the whole period was just very kind of frustrating and depressing. It's just very different. So that's it for the 1970s. The next one will be covering Ronald Reagan specifically. Actually, the next one will probably be the Middle East one, and then we'll cover Ronald Reagan. All right. Thank you very much.